Hello and welcome to the Driving the Business of Science podcast. I'm Keith Parent, CEO of Court Square Group and RegDocs 365. Before we start our discussion today, a little bit about the companies. For over 30 years, Court Square has been in the managed service technology company dedicated to empowering those who change lives, particularly pharmaceutical, biotech, med device companies. Our audit-ready, compliant cloud infrastructure provides life science companies with the highest level of data integrity, from preclinical to clinical to regulatory, all the way through the manufacturing process. RegDoc 365 is a qualified content repository hosting clinical and regulatory content, pretty much any content you would want to have, particularly in a highly regulated industry like the life sciences. We support many startups, and some of those startups bring us in tune with a lot of different companies. Today, I am speaking with Kevin Bittorf, who is one of the partners at SCxCMC. Kevin and I have known each other now for a while. I've met him for a number of ADDF conferences, and I'm sure he'll talk about some of those conferences. And what I wanted to do with title today's podcast was CMC, what do you mean? You know, I've talked with a lot of people about CMC, and I get a lot of different answers around CMC. So Kevin, I'd love you to enlighten me. Tell me a little bit about SCxCMC, and then let's talk a little bit about CMC in general.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. CMC, well, let's go back. It's a regulatory definition. It's chemistry and manufacturing and controls. It goes along with the section in your NDA that you hopefully will submit when you're fully complete. Chemistry, manufacturing, controls equals CMC. I've always looked at CMC as the manufacturing innovation space to be in. And in the since I've been consulting and since I've been working, the regulatory agencies have loosened up or looked at the science behind CMC versus just doing the same thing over and over. It used to be the traditional way of CMC was you do your 3 validation batches and you're now validated and ready to sell your material. Now looking at it and more the business and science behind it, more of my background is from Alberta, Canada. I grew up in the oil and gas industry where we always did improvements. We always looked at how can we make this better, more efficient, cheaper. Oil and gas is very much a commodity on the pipeline. That doesn't feel like a commodity at the gas station at all. But there you do engineering work to continually improve. Where the pharma industry early on in the 90s and early 2000s, where really you submitted your CMC section, you had to live by that section, and if you wanted to change, you had to go through another regulatory approval. So I had the opportunity to work with FDA and a lot of different innovative companies that were looking to understand the science behind CMC and the business behind that as well. Because if you can keep on improving your manufacturing process by understanding the science, you reduce cost of goods and you actually increase your quality of your material as well, which is what the patients see. So it's not necessarily reducing your cost of goods 100% of the time, it's also improving the quality of your patients. So starting off in my career in the pharmaceutical industry at Perrigo, it's a large generic over-the-counter company based in Western Michigan. We looked at making over-the-counter drugs cheaper, better, faster. And I had the opportunity to bring in their first PAT system. So it's an online measurement system looking at the release of blends. So is this blend consistent? Is the patient going to see the same consistent blend each time? So I helped bring that initial one in, and that was over 20 years ago. And that was quite exciting. And then from there, I moved to Vertex Pharmaceuticals, where they really did look into the business and science side of CMC. I had the opportunity to look into process analytical technology, PAT. How can we improve our systems, do real-time measurement to ensure the patient got the same drug every time? And as well, one of the big initiatives I got to be a part of it and did the justification to start at Vertex was their continuous manufacturing system, where we looked at the cost of manufacturing, this cost of scale up of manufacturing from a phase 1 clinical trial through to commercial, and did the business justification why it'd be cheaper to do a continuous manufacturing system versus a traditional batch system. And the cool part is it's cool science too. So you had the business part justify the cool science. And that's really what I love about what I do is not just looking at the cool science, it's actually how do you justify that and put it in a company and make it worthwhile to implement.
So Kevin, let me talk to you a little bit. So SCxCMC Solutions, that's your company.
Yeah.
When did you start it? Why did you start it? Did you want to get out of big pharma? Tell me a little bit of what got you going.
Yeah. So SCxCMC Solutions, we started almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years ago in March. And the SC stands for science. It also stands for supply chain. And also, like I say, simplified consulting. Reason why we started it, we like working with a lot of small, medium-sized companies. A large company would have their function hired full-time, that what I would do full-time in their company. But we saw an opportunity to help a lot of small startups in the greater Boston, Cambridge area, and along the East Coast, and we have clients in the West Coast as well, help them understand the CMC science and look at when do you need to put in certain implementation of your chemistry, your formulation development, and your manufacturing, what you can put off, and look at that with the financial justification and look at a risk management. You have to, at the end of the day, you have to do it all, but when do you do it? So we help our clients with an integrated team. So we have a fully integrated team. We look at regulatory affairs, quality assurance. We have a chemistry experts, formulation experts, supply chain experts, clinical supply experts as well, and packaging. So what we like to do is bring in your full CMC team in to help, set up your small company or solve your small company's problems, and just bring in the right expert at the time. I
So
find too many.
everybody
Yeah.
on that, and so everybody's got a different topic that they kind of
Yeah.
know about, but it's all related to CMC.
Yeah, I like to bring in experts. A lot of consultants look at, you have a general contractor. He's good at a lot of things, but not spectacular at it. So we look at it, it's like, why not bring the expert that can solve your chemistry problem, the formulation problem, your regulatory problem. Everyone in our group knows a lot what each other do, and we can back each other up. But when the problems become hard, you really do want that specialist in there. And what we do is bring together a group of specialists to help solve your problem more efficiently.
Interesting. You had actually introduced me to a company I never even knew existed, and their claim to fame was that they looked at, I think, was it the chemical compound or however the structure of the chemicals, things like that. I didn't even know those companies existed out there.
Oh, yeah, looking at the crystal structure, how to more efficiently get it absorbed into your body, and then more efficiently make it manufacturable later on. That's a really early important part of drug development and your phase two range, phase one, phase two, as you're doing that, and it will lead to future success. And I always say, one of my sayings about CMC is kind of like the referee in a football game. If we're doing a really good job, you don't notice it. All your clinical trials or supplies are supplied on time. You have a really nice, stable 2-year shelf life formulation. Your supply chain's managed, and everything just gets to the patient on time. Or when you're launching, all your launch quantities are there, and everyone's happy. The star at the end of the day, the star of the show, it's always the molecule, the molecule that cures cancer, that works on your IBD, whatever the disease state that is. CMC, helps move that star along to ensure everyone gets the proper dosing.
Tell me a little bit about, if I think about the whole drug development life cycle and I go from preclinical to clinical to approval to manufacturing. Tell me
Yeah.
about the CMC fit in every area of that, or tell me about what the difference is when you go from preclinical to clinical to manufacturing. How does that work?
Yeah, CMC really takes over as you're going from preclinical to phase one. That's where CMC starts to get involved. Is you pick your preclinical asset, you've nominated your molecule that you believe is going to move forward in the clinic. CMC will look at how do we manufacture that molecule. So we'll really look at, for small companies, so which vendors can manufacture that molecule. Do they have the proper GMP certifications to manufacture that? How do you formulate that molecule? So at the end, this is for human dosing. So what does your phase one human dose look like, and formulate that so it's stable. And not only stable, once it gets into your gut, will it get absorbed? So there's a lot of molecules out there, you can make stable, but once in your gut, it does not get absorbed and has no clinical efficacy. So the big part of our job is to look at that drug, look how it gets absorbed into your intestine and where it gets absorbed in your intestine, ensure that happens. And then that's your phase one results. And then as you're getting to phase two and phase three is scaling that up. So your phase one clinical trials can be anywhere from 5 to 40 people, depending on the indication. And then as you're scaling up, going to phase two is manufacturing and understanding your chemistry, so you don't have any impurities in there, or if you know what, or at least be able to control your impurities, and then scale up your formulation so you have a cost-effective formulation that's shelf life stable. As we look at it, as usually the ideal is a tablet that's good for 2 years on the shelf with no instability. So you start working on that, getting a nice clinical dose to the patient. And then as you're going to phase 3 is looking at your quality by design, your good engineering work, and looking at how do you make this efficiently? How do you ensure it's the same dose every time through process analytical technology or continuous manufacturing, or just traditional batch manufacturing? How do you ensure it's consistent every time? You look at your different types of packaging. That's when you start phase 3 is when you start working with marketing on colors, making sure that whatever color is doesn't affect the drug, the packaging is stable. So you have a nice patient-friendly packaging as well. You know, if it's a chronic dose, you probably want a blister that's with days of the week on there to make life easier for them. But CMC goes through from the start all the way through to commercial launch, and then it's just ongoing manufacturing once you hit commercial launch.
When you start early on, do most companies manufacture their own drug, or
No.
do they get somebody else to manufacture it?
With the companies I work with, most companies get someone else to manufacture. And a lot of what we do early on is vendor selection. And we look internationally and domestically for vendor selection. Depending on the molecule, sometimes there's a very limited amount of vendors that can do it, from a specialty chemistry or specialty formulation. So you have to look at those, or if it's just general chemistry with a nice easy formulation, you have a lot more selection criteria. There's the big large companies like a Thermo Fisher or Catalent, or more specialty companies as well, that you can look for. And each one of them has their positives and negatives going anywhere. It all depends on the CEO of the company and what their views are on outsourcing. And phase 1 and phase 2, generally you pick a different vendor for phase 1 and phase 2 than you do for phase 3 and commercialization. So a lot of companies are
Is that because of volume issues?
volume issues and capacity as well. You look at, sometimes you want a smaller specialty company. There's a company in Canada, Coriolis, that looks at phase 1 and phase 2 formulation development and manufacturing. They're very highly specialized in that area, so they're very good at it. They get it done fast, efficiently, and then you transfer it out to more of a company that's more used to doing commercial manufacturing from a day-to-day. So your early formulations, you have a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more last-minute changes, where commercial manufacturing, you really want a very robust company that's just used to doing the same thing over and over and over again very well. So it's a different.
Are there advantages sometimes to when you hear people talk about manufacturing of drug products, things like that? Are there advantages to have it done here in the States versus elsewhere, or do people look to outsource that, offshore and then bring it back in here? Does that happen with drug development as well? Or
It happens with both. It happens with both, and given the political environment, it's very interesting now with the potential new tariffs and not tariffs as well. For drug product, generally we look doing it in North America or Europe. Is they're just used to the EMEA, FDA regulations, and not to say India and China are not. And it's just easier from a supply chain standpoint. Active pharmaceutical ingredients and as well as starting materials. A lot of that starting materials come from Asia, India, China, Eastern Europe. It can be made in the US. It's just there's a cost associated with that. And doing your final GMP processes, it can be done anywhere. Like I said, I've worked with companies in Egypt for drug products. I've worked with companies all over the world. It's just what makes sense for your corporate strategy. And that's what I talk with. Where are you dosing it? So a lot of times for clinical trials, if you're dosing it in the US, it's easier to manufacture in the US. You just go from manufacturing that. You don't have to worry about anything. If you're dosing in Europe, you're probably better off manufacturing in Europe if most of your clinical trials there, because there's another release, qualified person needs to release it, and they're European based, and having them shipped out to the US for release, it's more difficult. Easy to do, just adds that extra bit of logistics to it. So it really depends on corporate strategy, where the initial clinical trials are being done, where your larger clinical trials are being done, and where do you plan to do your initial commercial launch.
So Kevin, I initially met you at one of the conferences, and you're pretty big in helping to do a lot of different conferences. Tell me a little bit about some of the conferences you work in, why you're so involved in some of these things, or yeah, what's happening in that realm.
No, I've been doing nonprofit conferences for over 13 years. Reason why I do is I keep on learning. Like I want to learn about the science. I want to be on the innovative side of the science as well. I did my PhD at the University of Alberta, and I went to a lot of smaller, intimate conferences where you got to know the scientists and you really got to understand academic scientists versus industrial scientists and how they work together. And I wanted to base conferences on that. So one of the conferences I do and I started with is the compaction simulation forum. So what the compaction simulator does, it models making a tablet or a pill, one pill at a time, and you get all the data that you would have on an industrial press. So it mimics a full industrial press from a speed standpoint, a compression standpoint. Some of them heat up, and you're able to learn how your drug will be scaled up with only 100 milligrams or 100 grams of material or 50 milligrams of material versus having to scale it up on hundreds of kilos to see an error. So one of my first errors I made, and the reason why I went to compaction simulation is I scaled up a batch, it's a 400 kilogram batch, a lot of API in there, which was very expensive. We scaled up, we compressed the tablets, and we're getting tablet fissures because we didn't have enough lubricant in there early on. And if we had a compaction simulator, we would have been able to test that early on 100 grams of material and figure out, our errors in our formulation. So we fixed the error. It was it was an unforeseen error at the time. And then we bought a compaction simulator and I started the conference. And the reason why I wanted to do the conference was it's a pre-competitive way to understand what people are doing with their equipment. Like I said, CMC is the vehicle. It's not the star. The API is the star. So you have a whole bunch of people talking about best practices in manufacturing, how to understand your tablet compression. You have a lot of data analysis and how people look at data. And then with that, so that was the first one I did. And the one you and I met, Keith, was the Advancing Drug Development Forum, the ADDF. And it really looks at how do you bring in innovations into a pharma company? What does it look like from the inception of the innovation all the way through to the completion of the innovation? It really looks at it from a holistic standpoint. It looks at it from what your innovation is. We always have someone talk about innovations. It looks to potentially funding the business of that innovation, the funding of that innovation, and how that goes. It looks into the regulatory implications of that innovation. How do you get that through the regulatory affairs? It looks into other things like supply chain. It looks into data analysis. Artificial intelligence is now a bigger topic of ours as well. And then we also have a fireside chat at the end with a couple of senior leaders, how they see the industry going and really the direction of the industry and how innovations are moving forward and how they've seen it compared to the past. So it's a really great conference on innovations, how and really the business of innovation itself. And I learn a lot through that, and I bring that through to my consulting practice and helping people solve their problems.
Well, I think that particular conference is interesting because the ADDF happens in December, so you've had the whole year to kind of retrospectively look at what happened over the year, where we at. So there's some very interesting conversations to be had out in the audience.
Oh yeah, it's good. We're going to be talking about a lot of, I think, a political conversation in there as well, depending what happens by the end of this year.
That's
Should be
very true.
with the NIH funding, where funding is, where funding's not, small business funding, how people are looking at manufacturing, where they're manufacturing. There's going to be a lot of lessons learned this year with given the new administration.
Absolutely. Tell me a little bit more about where you see the future of CMC going. And you mentioned AI a little bit there. Are there things you're working on right now and trying to build some of that into your thinking as you're working with your client base?
Yeah, there's a big opportunity for AI. There's a lot of data that comes out of CMC, from your manufacturing, your tablet press, to your wet granulation, to all of your dissolution profiles. Is how can you start interrelating all of that information from a material property standpoint? Because every active pharmaceutical ingredient is different, but a lot of them have similar properties. So can you start looking at gathering that data and predicting what kind of manufacturing process you'll need? Predicting when you would potentially have a deviation or out of spec on an ongoing manufacturing. Like, there's a lot of factors that people don't consider in manufacturing. For example, the time of the year. Does that matter? Sometimes it does. Like if you have a very humid sensitive API. That might matter if you're manufacturing in the summer versus the winter. People sometimes don't pick up on that. So there's a lot of data factors that go into manufacturing and understanding what can go wrong. And it's using that AI to really, I look at it as help triage where your potential problems are. I don't think it's the solution, but it's going to help you triage and maybe look at things in a different way moving forward. And I'm starting to use more and more of it as I get more and more data, and that's really where it's helpful.
When you talked a little bit earlier about continuous manufacturing versus batch manufacturing,
Yeah.
can you just talk about a little bit about what the difference is? And in my view, I've always thought of pharmaceutical manufacturing, particularly small molecule, as just taking what you do in the lab and just making it bigger.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the way you should look at it, or is there a different way to looking at it?
Well, that's traditional batch manufacturing. You mix it in a small blender, you turn it, you put it on tablet press, you make it one at a time. Whereas, I grew up with continuous manufacturing in the oil industry. You started with your raw material and you shipped ethylene outside the pipeline. So it's really looking at how do you do that in a pharmaceutical? So you have from a drug product standpoint, and I'm actually doing a conference on continuous manufacturing as well. Learning more and more as I did that from Vertex is you start off with your active pharmaceutical ingredients, all of your non-active, your binders, your excipients, your lubricants, and you blend them together and then either roll or compact them, do some wet granulation, blend them again, mill them, and then compress them. And then you coat your tablets to the elegant coat, or sometimes it's a functional tablet coating, and then packaging it. So it's running 24/7, 7 days a week for X amount of time for your material. So it makes a lot of sense in extremely high volume products. There's a lot of potential high volume products out there coming up, depending on the disease state, for chronic illnesses. But the other thing it also does, if you have a low volume product, instead of what you said, going from your lab bench scale and just making it bigger. So what this enables you to do is staying at that low bench scale and just running it longer and not making it bigger. So you eliminate all your scale up risk because you're running at the same small bench scale and you're just running it longer. So it eliminates the risk of scaling up and how the molecule reacts. Because every molecule reacts differently under different pressure, different speed, different shear rates. So if you have something sensitive, you just run it longer.
Interesting. Well, that's been a very interesting and enlightening 20 plus minutes of talking about CMC. I learned a lot. I think it was great to understand that. I'd love to have you back on, Kevin, and talk a little bit more. Maybe we'll get into a couple very distinct areas within CMC. That would be good to know. Being a podcast of, driving the business of science, I don't know that most people think about all the different avenues that you spoke about today and some of the things that you had to think about. And I'm sure that first mistake that you made, where you had those fissures in the tablets, I'm sure there was some kind of a costly mistake in there. But
it was.
so there's always a cost, and business is business, and people want to try to figure out how best to get things out there. So I think that it's a very interesting area, and another area where most people just don't understand it. And that's really the science aspect of putting those drugs together. Maybe in the future, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other areas, apart from small molecule biologics, things like that. And we can start to get into some of those as well. Do you have any last second thoughts for the crowd, and just talk about, maybe you want to just kind of close it out with some of the different shows that you're working on, and give people a heads up as to what to look forward to?
Yeah, the nonprofit conferences, the Compaction Simulation Forum is being hosted at Genentech in South San Francisco. That is the second week of June. We're working on the Continuous Manufacturing Conference, which is actually going to be hosted in Belgium, it looks like, and that will likely be the last week of September. The dates are yet to be finalized. And then the Advancing Drug Development Forum is always the second Thursday of December. And we are working on the agenda now, and we hope to have some topics out for everybody in the next month, what we're going to be concentrating on. So it will, like I said, this was going to be an interesting one, given the new environment we're in.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience for listening and for being with us again. Kevin, as always, great to speak with you. And I want to thank everybody again. Again, this is the Driving the Business of Science podcast. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.